Scream. I'm going to first off start by saying it's not the most creative title in the world, is it? Let's face it, because the first film in the franchise was of course called that, and the other three sequels that we've had were just Scream 2, 3 and 4. They could have called this Scream 5, but they decided to keep it simple and just call it Scream. And I went into this film thinking, why do we need another Scream film? Because it follows the exact same narrative formula as every other film in the franchise, apart from a few characters who are introduced as part of this entire series, but the gist of it is there and we just get the same thing over and over again. So I thought, what difference could this film make? And in a way we know it's not for money, because as successful as the franchise has been over the years, it's not a blockbuster series. So I think the motive for making this film was a bit unusual, but despite that, I thought, yeah, they've got something up their sleeves here. I think they could pull something out of the bag and it could be a very successful film in the series. Set 25 years after the original film, a new Ghostface killer emerges in the town of Woodsboro. Sidney Prescott returns to town and attempts to uncover the truth. That's it. That's essentially the story, and it just seems very, very similar, and probably too similar actually, to every other sequel that we've had in the franchise so far. But to be perfectly honest with you, after watching this, I was pleasantly surprised. And Scream is a film that is like a requel, which in this case is a story that has functions that make it like a sequel, a remake and a reboot to the original story. This one is like all three really, and it does it in very different ways. So it is a sequel, of course, because it's set after the original film and other events in the other sequels that we've had, but it feels closer to the originals than perhaps any of the other sequels that we had. And when you watch the film, you'll know what I mean. It feels like a remake because a lot of plot elements are very identical to the original film. And it also feels like a reboot because it has other new characters into it, as well as the characters we all know and love, that make the franchise their own now, where it's kind of passing the torch, so to speak. This is also the first Scream film to have not been directed by Wes Craven, who unfortunately passed away in 2015. And this film was made by two directors called Matt Bettinelli-Olpin and Tyler Gillett. And these two directors have made horror films in the past, including Devil's Due and Ready or Not. So they already tick one box where they have already made horror films, but probably not to this mainstream scale. And their approach was something that was very similar to the previous installments, but they also put their own stamp on it as well, particularly in terms of the visuals. There were elements in the film that made us kind of feel closer to the characters, and it was done in a way that we haven't seen in the series before, where it was somewhat emotional because of the nostalgia. And it's weird because Scream was nostalgic, and when you think of nostalgic film and television, you think of something that just drives your emotions of things that you've loved and enjoyed growing up. You know, when you look back at Star Wars, or you look at Lord of the Rings, or you look at Harry Potter or Disney or anything like that. But this is nostalgia about a slasher series. How do you get emotional about a series like that involving a serial killer and mass murders, etc.? It was a nice combination of celebrating that legacy of the series while also giving us a nice strong reintroduction of the series at the same time with its new cast members and characters. I mean, in my opinion, the nostalgic factors of Scream aren't just the violence and the murder in the films, but more so the character arcs and their backgrounds. And on the subject of violence, as you'd probably expect from a Scream film, if not any other slasher film, it certainly was that. And I'd probably go so far as say that it is the most violent film in the franchise so far, and I think that was largely due to the attention to detail from the murders that were committed. In this one, like the original film, you got a combination of very disturbing violence alongside emotion, and the comedy was clever as well because it does poke fun at the traditional conventions of the horror genre while in itself being a horror slasher film. And what I also appreciated about this film was that, particularly due to the use of technology and mobile phones, that it was blended really nicely with the nostalgia factor. So it had caught up with the modern audience, and it worked really well because, you know, there were some traditional elements in the film that were, you know, using a mobile phone to contact someone like the killer does to the people who they do eventually kill. Well, in this case, they still use the phone, but they use texts and Snapchat and Instagrams and all those things like the people in 2022 do. So I think it shows today's young people through this film the standards and the use of certain conventions that have always been so fundamental to the Scream franchise over the years. Now, this film's leading stars are what one would call millennial stars, in which they were born in the 90s and the early noughties, which is crazy in itself because the original film was made in 1996 and some of those hadn't even been born at that point. And like the original cast, there weren't many well-known stars in this one. Now, the film's main protagonist was young Sam, played by Melissa Barrera. Now, it's an interesting one because she's a new character who has been introduced to the series, yet she's also trying to celebrate and honour the legacy of the previous protagonist in the series. And Sam is someone who conveniently is linked to other characters in the series who we have seen before. I'm not going to spoil it, but it is those connections to characters of the past that do make her a very strong and leading character within her own right. And that's what she was. She was fierce, she was strong, she had vulnerabilities as well. Almost kind of still playing that, you know, damsel in distress stereotype that we see in horror films. But she was someone who was like Sydney way back then, because she was an innocent young girl who had been engulfed and been at the centre core of why these things were happening. And I thought Barrera's performance was very good, and I'm hoping that she, if there are any more films, that she carries on playing that character. And Jenna Ortega plays Tara, who is Sam's younger sister, and even though she's 19 years of age, it's almost as if for the first time that the Scream franchise has included a child, because she looks significantly younger than everybody else does. And I liked Ortega's performance because you could just feel the sheer fright and horror of what she was going through, the trauma and also vulnerability in other ways, which you'll have to watch the film to find out what I mean by that. Jack Quaid plays Richie, who is ultimately the boyfriend of Sam, and he's someone who is almost like that knight in shining armour kind of figure, but as it's a slasher film, not everybody is who they are. I'm not saying he is or anyone else is, I'm just saying that sometimes in certain cases, like in the Scream franchise, certain stereotypes do end up being broken while also being celebrated. Of course, the ultimate nostalgia, Neve Campbell, Courtney Cox and David Arquette all reprised their roles as Sidney Prescott, Gale Weathers and Dewey Riley. They were all stars of the original film and a number of its sequels, but here they're just supporting characters. And I'm glad they were, because it's not all about them anymore. They've all got their stories complete. Like Sydney's moved on with her life. We know her story. We know things that have happened to her. We don't need to see any more from Sydney in terms of leading the franchise, because that's all done. And the same with Gale Weathers as well, and Dewey Riley. I feel as though their stories are also complete, but they played a significant part in the film alongside the leading characters. People may be disappointed that they might not have been in the film as much as they probably could have been. Ultimately, it was about passing the torch and giving the franchise to the new stars. A bit like the original Star Wars cast in a way, by giving it to the new leading stars in the sequel trilogy. So overall, Scream actually really surprised me. It's definitely the best sequel in the franchise, which would make it the best since the original. And as I said at the beginning of this video, I was a little bit like, I'm not really sure what else they could add to this series. They probably should have put it to bed. I don't think there needed to be a fifth film, but after watching it I thought, oh, interesting. I'm actually looking forward to seeing what they do next. But at the same time, this film did feel like it really was an ending to the series. So yeah, Scream is a film that I think Wes Craven would have been immensely proud of. What did you think of Scream? How do you think it compares to the original film? Do you think it's as good as that one? Or do you think it's just an absolute load of rubbish and that they should put this series to bed once and for all now? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, if you did want to enjoy this video, then please hit the like button and subscribe for more, and have a notification bell tick so you're notified when I upload a new video, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care, everybody.